So, hello everybody. Hope you can see things okay and you can see things clearly. I'll be going through some things in the tutorial, and then it'll be a Q&A session, but you can ask questions or queue your questions up in the chat window on YouTube as we're going, as they occur to you, or you can keep them to the end. It's up to you. I just put this up here to show you the people who said they were going to attend this session. Quite a mixed bag there, really. Various companies from all over the world, so it's good to see quite a lot of people interested. What I'm going to start off with is, before I get into some tutorial stuff, is I just wanted to quickly go through some of the things on the self-study examination dashboard, just to make sure everyone's up to the same kind of speed. This is Andrew Phipps's dashboard, who's taken a couple of exams already. So under study, we've got the guide and the outline and the modules, which I'm sure you've all looked at, because you need those modules to start studying. The important thing is, when you study module 1, then take module 1 exam. Don't go on to study module 2 until you've done that. There's some example questions here, so if I click on this, it will download a PDF. And in the PDF, these are just some example questions. There's around about 20 questions in each of the exams. These aren't questions in any of the exams, but they're examples. Gives you the section that we're talking about here, and then the question, place for you to answer. Now, to know whether you're correct or not, there are links here that don't tell you what the answer is, but they take you to the content that essentially provides the answer. So why is sustainability part of being pragmatic? If we click this, it'll take us to the content, which is the sustainability. What is pragmatism? So obviously the answer is going to be on this page. The other thing I just wanted to point out under social, because various people have asked about it, is there any place where you can post how you're finding the training or questions or whatever like that? And so there's a discussion on LinkedIn. If you click that, it will take you to the group, which you obviously need to join. I haven't really published this, so that's why there's only 20 members and there's no questions at the moment, but you know, be the first to post something. The license link will take you to your license, so you can update your details if you want to. This is someone else's license, obviously. So that's really all I wanted to show you on that. So going into the tutorial part, I wanted to talk today a little bit, 20 minutes or so, about adoption, how you adopt POET and PEAF, how do you use them, basically. So POET and PEAF are frameworks. That means they're an expression of best practice. So they can be viewed as a kind of a target as to perhaps what you should be doing and the ways in which you should be doing it. Doesn't mean to say you're going to adopt the whole thing right off the bat. Doesn't mean you're going to adopt the whole thing over time. But it's kind of a potential target state for how to do enterprise architecture. So I'm going to go through a kind of a process here. So here we have the overall transformation domain of an organization. We start with the strategizing, going through the road mapping. This area is what we deem to be enterprise architecture. Then we go past this solid line here, which is into all of the work we need to do to execute projects, the projects that we formulated out of our enterprise architecture, that go through various phases. So we're going to be looking at maturing this part of your company, the enterprise architecture part of your company. Because the way to use a framework is you don't take a framework and just use it to do roadmaps. You use a framework to change and mature how you do roadmaps. You don't take a framework and then just do a strategy. You take a framework that change, and then you use the framework to change how you do strategy. So, and the process I'm going to explain here is essentially the same process that we would use for maturing or changing any part of the organization. We'd understand what that part of the organization did, we would model that part of the organization, then we would figure out a target state and some intermediate states that we want to go through with that part of the organization in order to figure out physically how we're going to make those changes. And those things are guarded by reference models, etc. So we're essentially going to do exactly the same thing, but we're doing it to ourselves, so to speak. We're doing it to the enterprise architecting part of the transformation domain of the enterprise. So right down at the bottom we have the physical world, which definitely exists. There are people doing strategy, there are people doing road mapping, so this is the physical world that actually exists. I've missed out the configuration model type level here because it's not really pertinent. So in an organization, your organization, there will definitely be the physical world where people are doing this work. Now, there may or may not be a physical model of how that work is being done, how we are doing strategizing, road mapping, how we are doing enterprise architecture. There probably is not a logical model of that, and there almost certainly is not some kind of conceptual model. This kind of level is almost a conceptual model. So what we need to do is we want to adjust how we currently do enterprise architecture to a more mature way of doing enterprise architecture. So we want to improve or mature how we do enterprise architecture. I try and talk in terms of maturing how you do enterprise architecture because it's not really correct to say whether people are doing it in a right way or a wrong way, because it depends a lot on your organization, how complex you are, where you are in your journey, and lots of other factors. The way to do EA in a smaller, less complex company may be less mature, but it's apt for that company. A very complex and very volatile company might not be apt. So it's a case of levels of maturity. So when we say we're going to adjust how we currently do EA to a more mature way of doing EA, what we're saying is in the future this is the physically how we want to do enterprise architecture, and that may be based on some kind of much longer target state of how we want to do enterprise architecture, because we're not necessarily going to change everything how we do enterprise architecture all in one go. There's going to be some potentially intermediate states. Why are we doing this? Because we want to increase the effectiveness, efficiency, agility and durability of how we do enterprise architecture. Now, in order to move from currently physically how we do enterprise architecture to physically how we want to do it in the future, we need to have a plan to physically do that change. We need a plan to buy a tool. We need a plan to physically change the processes people are operating, etc. But we can't just invent that plan out of thin air. We need to think about what these states are here. So as with anything else, what we really need, before we start changing what people actually do and how they do it, we want to model that. So we want to create a physical model, an intermediate state physical model of our first step to maturing enterprise architecture related to our intermediate state. Now, obviously, that physical model has to be done in the context of the physical model of how we currently do it. So if that's not modeled, we need to model physically how we currently do EA, so then we can physically figure out how that one needs to change going forward. Getting the physical model will then allow us to create a physical plan to physically change how we're actually doing enterprise architecture. Now, this physical model is not going to be created, or shouldn't be created, in a vacuum. When we think of physical models of how to do some part of the operations part of the organization, we don't do that in isolation. We tend to base that physical model on a higher level logical model of the domain that we're looking at. In this case, we want a logical model of how to do enterprise architecture. And in turn, that logical model tends to be or should be based on a conceptual or a capability model of how to do enterprise architecture, and more of a contextual operating model of how to do enterprise architecture as well. So where the hell do we get these things from? Well, that's where POET and PEAF come in. POET is the pragmatic operating model for enterprise transformation. So whilst it's an operating model and actually the conceptual model for enterprise transformation, part of the enterprise transformation is how to do enterprise architecture, and therefore it covers the enterprise architecture domain as well. So POET covers the whole of this entire domain, the whole of the transformation domain. An operating model and a capability conceptual model should be at a higher level than the domain we're actually looking at, if it's any good. The logical model target is basically based on PEAF. Sorry, I didn't explain what this X was here. So what you need to create is your target operating model for how your organization at a conceptual and operating model level wants to do the entire enterprise transformation domain. And you need to look at the entire transformation domain because that's what's important to the business. They don't care how you're doing enterprise architecture. What they care about is the strategy at the front and there's change stuff coming out the bottom. So POET provides probably 80 to 90% of that. The reason there's an X there is because what we tell people is that you change POET to be your operating model for enterprise transformation. So the X is kind of just a placeholder for the name of your organization. A company I work for, their name began with L, so their name was Lowet. So you take POET as like almost potentially the nirvana, sounds a bit arrogant to say that, and then you change it to make it your operating model for enterprise transformation. Now, because we're providing 20% of what provides 80% of the benefit, we would say that probably 95% of POET you don't need to change, but you may need to change some of the names of things because names are used differently in different organizations. Obviously the next level down is the logical model. So PEAF is essentially the logical model of how to do enterprise architecture, and again you should take PEAF and create your own enterprise architecture framework based on it. It's not a big job. There's a publishing platform you can also buy which helps you modify all of this content, so it's not just in a book, it's actually in a tool which you can move about and change as you require. But again, you shouldn't need to do much changes to it at all, maybe 5%. So that's the flow. So we have a high level understanding of how the entire transformation domain is done. We have a lower level understanding at the logical level of how enterprise architecture in the organization should be done, and we use that to create a physical model. So the physical model is created in the context of understanding what our long-term goals are. Once we've got this physical model, then we can do a physical change. So as I said, these are intermediate states, and it may be that you do one thing this year. Maybe you adopt the concept of enterprise debt and you change the way you're doing governance and lobbying. Maybe next year you buy an EA modeling tool. Maybe the year after that you change how you're doing strategizing. But it's all guided by this long-term view of where you're going, and that's where many organizations get into trouble when they don't use a framework. They change parts of what they're doing without any or enough kind of long-term view as to what the whole is going to look going forward. That's not always the case, of course, but generally that kind of tends to be what happens. So this entire process of how POET and PEAF is used to mature how we do enterprise architecture, as I said, is basically the same as how we would mature or change any part of the operations part of the enterprise. So if you work in a bank, for example, we might be changing the the account maintenance function or something. Well, you wouldn't just physically go and start changing that. you would need to figure out what your changed physical model would be, and the changed physical model would be based on a logical model, which would be based on an operating model, kind of banking operating model. So these two things are very, very important because they provide the high-level context and allows you, these are essentially the things that allow you to think strategically but act tactically. So here this is the strategic thinking and targets of where we're going, and we're making sure that these tactical things that we're changing once a month, once a year, whatever, are in line with our long-term goals. So that's all I really wanted to run through. What's the time? It's 20 past at the moment. Let's see. Nobody's entered any questions at the moment. So what I'll do is I'll go through a few more things which I had up my sleeve. I just wanted to, these are covered in the first module of the training, to go quickly through these barriers to adoption. So there are various reasons why, or major reasons why people don't adopt enterprise architecture frameworks, why companies don't spend enough time or money on maturing how they do enterprise architecture, that kind of thing. So these are the things that stop us from helping organizations and stop people inside those organizations getting those organizations to spend some money improving how they do, or maturing how they do enterprise architecture. The first thing is this domain blindness. This is actually a magic eye picture, and you need to cross your eyes in order to be able to see the three-dimensional picture there. But the fundamental idea here is that many organizations don't really even think about their transformation domain. They know they have people working on projects and doing roadmaps and all those kinds of things, but they don't spend enough time thinking about how those things should be and could be improved. They only spend their time thinking about how parts of operations can be improved. So that's one of the main things. People, organizations, generally management, tend not to even see the transformation domain. The second one is relating to what we call the red pill, sort of related to the first one really, but this is a reference to the Matrix, of course. Most organizations operate in this world where the only thing they can see in the organization is the operations domain. The only thing they can see is the blue pill. The only thing they can see is improving operations. We need to write a roadmap. We need to run projects. We need to, improve things. We've got problems we need to fix, etc., etc. We need to get organizations to take the red pill to start to see that reality is only being provided by the transformation domain. And if you don't spend some time in maturing the transformation domain, it's impacting how you can transform and change the operations domain, which is the target of most transformation. The next one is the timing paradox. So when there are bad times, people feel the pain of not having a mature enterprise architecture and transformation domain, but they don't have the resources to mature the transformation domain. So generally people will say, yeah, we like your stuff, Kevin, but we just, we don't have time. We've got this panic, we've got that panic, we need to get this released, and that's in a mess. We've got to clean this up, and it's all a mess. Well, the reason it's in a mess is because the transformation domain is almost certainly not mature enough. That's why there's a mess in the first place. When there are good times and there are resources to mature transformation, so people don't feel the pain. And because people don't feel the pain, they don't feel like they need to spend any money maturing something that they don't feel any pain about. So whether an organization is in kind of good times or bad times, you're kind of on a hiding to nothing to get the management to change. The process paradox. So what we're trying to do here essentially is to change the transformation domain, either part or some part of the transformation domain. If we're talking about enterprise architecture, then we're talking about transforming and maturing the enterprise architecture part of the transformation domain. But to engage with an organization, to do that, that organization is going to go through their current transformation processes. They're the processes that I have to relate to in order to get them to do some work. But the problem is their processes are broken, and because the processes are broken, one of the broken things is that maybe the transformation domain is not recognized, or people in the organization don't think enterprise architecture is important. Whatever the reasons, because that system is broken, it's difficult to fix the system, because the broken system is not allowing us to fix the broken system. I hope I've explained that. It can be a bit difficult to explain that, but this in the study guide, the words will explain it even much more clearly. Unconscious degradation. What's happened to a lot of organizations is a little bit like people's eyesight. So over the years, generally people's eyesight just gets slightly worse. You don't even notice it until something happens, like you start walking into lampposts, or you can't read menus in dark restaurants, or whatever it happens to be. Then you go and get some glasses, you put some glasses on, and then wow, it's like, oh, the world's suddenly in high definition. You never realized how poor your eyesight was. That's kind of like what happens with transformation domains in organization. Transformation domains generally potentially were more mature, or they were of the correct maturity for where the organization was in the past and where the world was in the past. But over time, that has either degraded or the requirements have increased, and therefore the effectiveness is that the transformation domain and the enterprise architecture part has been degraded, but people kind of haven't noticed it. It's just got slightly worse. And therefore what we suggest people to do is to get an eye test, essentially, which is to use the Enterprise Transformation Maturity Canvas as a very fast way to get a handle on whether your entire transformation domain, including enterprise architecture, is in need of some maturation. The false accomplishment problem. So many organizations have done enterprise architecture, or they think they've done enterprise architecture, and therefore when we try and talk to those organizations about enterprise architecture, or when people in those organizations want to talk to those organizations about enterprise architecture, you can get pushback from management because, yeah, we did that already. We sent a load of people on a course and we've done it, so we don't need to do it again. Oversimplification. Good quote by Einstein there. Whenever I teach people about POET and PEAF, and we run courses, inevitably you'll always get the question, well, okay, but do we have to adopt all of it? The simple question is no, actually, but people need to be aware of making things as simple as possible, but no simpler. So if you take something like PEAF, which is supplying you with only 20% of the things that you need, but this 20% is going to provide 80% of the benefit, because these 20% are the fundamental things you need to get right if you're going to be successful with enterprise architecture and you're going to be effective and efficient. The problem is, if management always wants to reduce things to the smallest thing, you can get to the point whereby it's kind of pointless. The changes you're making are so small and insignificant that it's kind of pointless. So just be wary that that's kind of one of the pushbacks you can get. Oh yes, well, can we make it simpler? And when you provide something that's simpler, the question will be, oh, can you make that simpler? Can we make it smaller? Can we make it smaller? Another one is framework misinterpretation. So there's two camps here. So in the one camp, I mean, we're just using the analogy of flying here, learning how to fly. One camp thinks that what we are providing is so high level and so simple, it's of no use whatsoever. So if you're learning to fly, they think we're going to say, oh, well, you know, there's weight and there's lift and there's thrust and there's drag, that's it, which is not correct. The other camp thinks that we're providing everything, and those people in those camps will say, oh, it's far too detailed and complicated. That's not the case either. What we're actually providing is something in the middle, this pragmatic camp. And this kind of relates back to one of the introductory diagrams, which shows how POET and PEAF fit between Zachman, which is a very high level simplistic way of looking at things with not a lot of guidance, which is kind of camp 1, and the TOGAF way of looking at things, which is a massively detailed way of looking at things. So 50% of the people I speak to will say, oh, PEAF and POET, yeah, it's too simple for us to use. And then the other 50% of people will say, oh yeah, it's far too complicated for us to use. In fact, the truth is in the middle. It's not. It's pragmatic. That's what it was designed to. That's where it was designed to fit, in the middle. I think this is the last one. Oh no, second to last one. So this one is about the avoiding reality. So what this is illustrating here is internally in an organization, people potentially, management potentially, are not going to want to hear about enterprise architecture. They're not going to want to look at it. Probably because enterprise architecture exposes things that people don't want exposed. It exposes problems, so we can fix these fundamental problems. It breaks down silos. People don't want silos being broken down. So potentially, internally, the company wants to avoid reality because it's too painful. From the external point of view, when I say external, we're talking about external consultancies. External consultancies won't want to tell you about this. They won't want to tell you about how to mature your EA capability, and they certainly won't tell you about utilizing PEAF or something as pragmatic as PEAF to mature it, because the reason is if you improve and mature how you do enterprise architecture, and in fact your whole of your transformation domain, but the enterprise architecture part is the most important because it's at the front. If you improve that, you won't need to pay consultancies a lot of money to do a lot of work. So a lot of this is one of the reasons why consultancies will say things like, oh no, don't look at frameworks, you don't need to look at frameworks, they're a waste of time, listen to us, we'll tell you what to do. It's because they don't want you to improve, because if you improve, you won't need them so much. That's one of the driving principles behind me creating PEAF, because I hated seeing highly paid consultancies coming in doing a lot of work when I could see you could improve how the company did enterprise architecture itself, then you wouldn't need these people. It's akin to the consultancies want to sell you fish, whereas pragmatic wants to teach you how to fish. Sounds like another slide coming on there. The other thing, the last thing was it's not sexy. So the world is driven by glossy things, buzzwords of the day, agile, digital transformation, flashy, nice web pages with 90% of white space and a nice grey bordered box that looks really pretty. Everything's driven by what looks sexy. So I thought to myself one day, is it that pragmatic and PEAF and POET are no good, or is it just that it's not sexy, or is it me? Do I not have the ability to create something that people want to look at? So I said to myself, well, okay, let me create something that's just sexy, utterly worthless but sexy, because PEAF is extremely useful but not sexy. So I created a book This is Hillary Clinton's book of what happened. I created another book exactly the same that's for sale on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and everywhere. Very similar cover, and inside there was just page after page of her face, because the preface said this book explains why Hillary lost the election, and she was going around blaming lots and lots of people as to why she lost the election, when in fact I thought that she was the main reason. So that was the reason for putting her face on the page. The point of this story, though, is that I then sent a copy of my book to Fox News. I previously sent them copies of my PEAF books, but of course they're not interested in that because that's hugely useful but not sexy, to see what they would do. What they did was actually talk about it and show it live on Fox News. There's a video on our channel that you can actually watch that video if you want to watch that video. So, you know, if I created something sexy, not a problem getting people interested in looking at it. Create something that's not sexy but useful, that's very, very difficult. That's a very big barrier to adoption. The last one actually is this one now, Save the Drowning Children. This refers to a story which I adapted. Most of people in an organisation spend their time saving the children that are drowning in the river, whereas Pragmatic is all about, our focus is stopping children falling in the river in the first place. I won't go into the details of the story. You can read that in the on the website if you want. I don't think that one's in the training pack actually, because it was content that was added. That's another thing about PEAF. The content is constantly evolving, being corrected, being added to on a daily, weekly or monthly basis, and rolled out into books and the website, etc, etc. So over to you. I hope there's going to be some questions now. If there's no questions, we'll finish, but let's see. So my video is interrupted. Sorry, Simlim or Silim, I can't do anything about that. Kevin, are you recording this presentation? If so, can you please provide the recording? Yes, it's being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel as soon as it terminates, essentially. There's one there on the from last month. So I'm aiming to do these kind of things once a month. I'd love to get more questions, because I'd like to spend as much time as possible answering people's questions. Let's just have a look to see. Okay, there are only 13 people on the in the session at the moment, so I'll just give you a moment or two to ask any questions. How many companies in the UK or in the world have adopted POET or PEAF? Have they seen success? Good question. So the first thing to say about that is that PEAF and POET were really designed to allow people to adopt them without using us as a consultancy. Of course, we'd love to help organisations as a consultancy, but that was one of the main drives. I couldn't stand consultancies getting paid huge amounts of money. So let me just pull up a web page. I can kind of answer that but maybe not in the way that you expected. So actually what you're talking about here is relating to credibility. On the website, oh no, you can't see this, hang on a second. So on the website, on the left here, there's a credibility button, and if you click that, there are various things you can click on. So there are various customers that have used it. These are some of them. There are some case studies which you can read. There are what we describe as our differentiators, what differentiates us and our frameworks from other companies and their frameworks. training feedbacks, the testimonials, the number of licenses. So there are currently 3,400 licenses that have been issued. Now that doesn't mean to say every person and every company that has been issued a license is using PEAF. We have kind of no way of of kind of getting that information really, but this gives you a breakdown of in terms of how many in each country. And then if you click here, you'll just see all of the licenses. Otherwise, if you come down here, they're split into how many end user companies. So Provident have just got a license and they're just starting to get trained in it using the free self-study. Various government bodies, academic institutions, etc., etc. So I'm kind of answering your question by answering a wider question, because I'm an architect and I think of bigger questions. So hopefully that gives you an answer. If not, ask away again. Have they seen success? Yes, I think various people have seen success. What else do I want to show you? Yeah, I would basically point everybody to this credibility page. And have a look at various things here. What is the difference between your framework and TOGAF? Good question. Well, this is the whole content of PF2, Poet, and PEAF. Just in case nobody knows, if you just click on the high-level frameworks, it will show you all of the frameworks. And if you click on any of these thumbnails, it will take you into that content. So to answer that question, this is another way of consuming our content. And for companies that adopt our framework and change their framework, they can then publish their framework like this on the intranet using our tools. So in order to answer that question, various ways. So this is the first diagram I pull up. So if we look at whether a framework is complex or whether it's simple, and whether it's detailed or whether it's just more theoretical, we get these kinds of things. So Zachman is very theoretical and very simple. It's just a grid. There's hardly any more guidance than that to understand it or use it. TOGAF is down here. It's very, very detailed and very, very complex. And before I wrote Poet and PEAF, that's all people had. They either had Zachman, which gave them too high level information to be particularly useful to actually help them to do anything, or they had TOGAF, which was, oh my god, I've just been on a TOGAF course, what the hell am I going to do now, where do I start? So Poet and PEAF fit in between these things. Poet is more high level and conceptual because it covers the entire transformation domain and it is an operating model. PEAF kind of covers this, what I would call the more the logical area of how to do enterprise architecture. So that's the first answer to your question. The second answer to your question is, let me show you this from PowerPoint because then the slide will build. Just give me a second while I pull this up. So here we have a very high level view of an enterprise that we're going to put TOGAF and various other frameworks on, like PEAF. What we're saying is the enterprise is represented by this black box here, but the enterprise in terms of doing transformation, because that's what we're talking about, that's our kind of domain, goes through various stages, which starts with strategizing, goes through various things. We run projects and we transition things into the physical stuff that people use in operations to do stuff. That maps onto Zachman one for one, basically. There are two red boxes here because when you analyze Zachman, you find out that they are two. Well, maybe he didn't miss this one out because he just says you take the entire framework and stick it up here, which is fair enough. But there is a deployer perspective down here that was missing, which I've had to add. So it kind of Poet maps kind of one for one. This here, the strategizing road mapping area, this is our enterprise architecture area. So what PEAF deals with is the entire enterprise. We're talking about everything outside the enterprise, which is the enterprise context. We're talking about everything inside the enterprise, but only at the contextual and conceptual levels. The width of this diagram, I'll get into that at the moment. TOGAF fits more down here. It's more of an enterprise IT solution architecture framework. Yes, it can be used for enterprise architecture, and it's sort of trying to grow that way, but it kind of mostly isn't still. We could have lots of arguments about that, but this is just our views. It only goes down into this elaboration part of the entire transformation domain. It doesn't go into constructing because it finishes at governing the implementation. So this is everything implementation. And it kind of goes up a little bit into road mapping, but not a huge amount. ITSM or ITIL fits kind of in here. ITIL started down here, but it figured out there were problems still here, and it was caused because the transition wasn't done correctly. And then it found there were problems in transition because the design wasn't done correctly and the strategy. So it's kind of grown up into the enterprise architecture area. So ITIL is not an EA framework, but it's touching in the EA area. This is one of the reasons why having POET is such a massively important thing. It allows you to understand how whatever frameworks that you're using, how they fit and overlap, and therefore which bits you're going to use out of which frameworks. I've put COBIT on here as well. I won't bother going into that. There's another framework that I haven't written yet. I have the collateral for, but I just haven't published it, called the Pragmatic Engineering, Enterprise Engineering Framework. So that is basically tackles everything which happens in projects. So after your enterprise architecture stuff, it's the what we call the enterprise engineering area. So what gap is it trying to address? I think I'll explain that. We are in the process of implementing TOGAF, ? In terms of implementing the PEAF framework in an organisation, how long would it take? Well, as I said, you don't have to implement the whole thing. You could implement the whole thing in maybe 3 months. But like with most things, the time it takes you to implement things is not really a function of the framework. It's more of a function of the people in the organisation that are going to, and more specifically the management, and how open they are and how much resources they're going to devote to it. How successfully are you in converting companies that are currently using TOGAF? Do you have customers that adopt both frameworks? We do have customers that do use both frameworks. Converting companies, it's very difficult. I think 90% of companies who say they use TOGAF don't use TOGAF. I have, specifically been employed by various companies, specifically because I was TOGAF certified, because they wanted people who were TOGAF certified. And then when I started working at those organisations, oh sugar, I've been doing all, oh yes, sorry, you should have seen my screen. Can someone let me know, did you see any of the screens that I was describing a little while ago? Probably not. Oh dear. Well, I'll go back and do that again very quickly. So most companies that say they're using TOGAF aren't using TOGAF, but then that's a barrier, because they say, oh, we are using TOGAF, therefore we don't need to use any other EA frameworks because we already have an EA framework. That comes back to one of those barriers to adoption that I was talking to you about before. Without the documented operating model, would you be able to implement PEAF? Yes, you are, because all we really need to do is model how you currently do enterprise architecture, agree what parts of that we need to change, and then actually executing those things. So yeah, sorry, let me nobody saw this entire thing. Did you see, not that one. I'll just run through this very quickly. This is what I was talking about when I was explaining about where Zachman, TOGAF, POET and PEAF fit in. So we have a quadrant which is complex and simple versus detailed and theoretical. Zachman is up here, very theoretical and very simple. TOGAF is down here, very complex and very detailed. And before POET and PEAF came along, which kind of fit in the middle and bridged that chasm, as I call it, that's all people had. They either had almost no guidance whatsoever or an overload. The other, I mean, TOGAF is, I'm not a TOGAF basher. I mean, it's horses for courses. They use the right tool for the right job. If you want to improve how you run projects, run IT projects in an architecturally centric way, TOGAF can help. It's a bit of a pig because it's very big and complex, but you know, it's fine for that. So but they miss some really fundamental things, and I'm an architect, so I think like an architect, so I'm really only concerned in thinking and documenting things and helping people get the 20% of the fundamental things right that create 80% of the benefit. Whereas TOGAF, I think a lot of the time, provides you the 80% that gives you 20% of the benefit. They miss the 20% that gives you the 80% of the benefit. This was the other diagram that I was referring to, where POET provides you with this very high level operating model for transformation. So we do strategy, then we do road mapping, then we start running projects that go through phases and which chuck things out into operation. As I said, this maps onto Zachman, kind of one for one, although he is missing this deploy perspective, which when you analyze his framework becomes apparent. I didn't just decide one day that he'd missed a perspective, it just became apparent when I analysed things. This is where PEAF fits. It looks at the whole EA area, which is this area at the top here. TOGAF fits in down here. As I said, it doesn't go into constructing because it does implementation governance down here. It does go into kind of road mapping a bit, but it's very IT centric, which is why it's not shown through the whole width. And it doesn't really get up into the detail of road mapping or strategizing. You know, these phases, you could use these phases for EA, and you know, we can have that argument, but it's basically a solution architecture based framework that's been tried to be bent to be used for enterprise architecture by providing all of the 80% of the detail and not the 20% of the fundamentals that are very important. This is where ITIL fits in, because it started down here and has moved up the food chain, as it were. COBIT is there, which I didn't go into, and then this pragmatic enterprise engineering framework covers this whole of the project world, basically. So all the work that happens before project is what we determine to be called enterprise architecture, and all the work that happens after that we generally call enterprise engineering. That doesn't mean to say other architecture's not going on in here, like application architecture, because it is, but we call that enterprise engineering. So sorry about that. This is one of those things where people can't shout out. I'm gonna maybe need to start running these sessions through GoToMeeting or something. So PEAF is based on model to do a best transformation. PEAF, is it only a top-down approach, conceptual to physical? So PEAF is a logical model, a logical architecture, a logical description of how to do enterprise architecture. That's why I say it only provides 20%. It doesn't give you the 80% of the physical detail. The physically how you do it in your organization might be different, because physically we have to transform you from physically how you're currently doing it to physically how you need to do it. So the guidance is logical. So it's like a reference model, although slightly lower than a reference model, because reference models tend to be conceptual. So it tells you how to do enterprise architecture, which is the strategizing and road mapping areas, and then the governance and lobbying down into projects, which is also of massive, crucial importance. That's what it is. Again, you don't use PEAF to do strategizing. You use PEAF to mature how you do strategizing. You don't use PEAF to do road mapping, you use PEAF to improve how you do road mapping, so then you can do road mapping in a more effective and efficient way. You don't use PEAF to do enterprise architecture, you use PEAF to mature how you do enterprise architecture so that you can then do enterprise architecture in a more efficient, effective, agile and durable, sustainable way. Any other questions? What's the time? 9 o'clock, so we've been going for about an hour. Where's my oh, I've lost the YouTube dashboard. Here it is. So we still have 13 people on the call. Anybody else got any more questions? And I do apologise for doing a lot of talking and not actually showing you the the diagram. Give you another 2 or 3 minutes. If there are no more questions, I'll close it down. EA develops architectural patterns and design patterns. What is the handoff? What is the handoff to solutions architecture? EA develops architectural patterns and design patterns. What is the handoff to solution architecture? Okay, so design patterns and architectural patterns are some of the things that are handed off. So what we're actually talking about there is, let me pull up a diagram. This one. No, probably not. Let's choose a different diagram. Let's choose this one. Screen. And I'll show you it this time even. So what we're actually handing over from enterprise architecture to the solution architecture, or two projects, is basically a conceptual structure for the part of the enterprise that is defined by the scope of that project. So we have an entire conceptual roadmap, structural roadmap going forward. Parts of that structural roadmap are passed down to the projects, along with principles, metrics, and the detailed objectives that flow from the business strategy that are for the scope of that project. I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, please feel free to ask it again. While we're here, if you're thinking about and adding a new question, that diagram also, I've drawn some well-known names over that information. So up here, this is the enterprise architecture level here. Enterprise architecture is all about working on the business model, working on the business motivation model, i.e. what's motivating us to change, what the operating model is, what the resulting current and target operating model need to be. Out of that we get a current and target capability model, and then the roadmap model. The current and target capability models is basically a structural roadmap, but we tend to talk in terms of capability models. This is a transformational roadmap of the projects and programs and initiatives required in order to be able to satisfy our journey. There's another diagram that kind of talks about that. That's in PEAF, which is down here, which is actually, let me show you in PowerPoint. It's much easier in PowerPoint. So what I wanted to show you was as this. So essentially, jumped back to there, which is very helpful of it. Thank you very much. Let's try that again. So we have our current model and we have our target model. This is structural models, and we need to create intermediate structural models at particular points in time that satisfy business and IT objectives that flow from the business strategy. And then on top of that, we then, once we've figured out what these structural models are, we figure out what programs, projects and initiatives we have, which will get us from our current model to our target model. So, solutions architecture to me is focused on specific solutions using the patterns and roadmaps developed by EA. Correct. Solution architecture is developing specific solutions for one part of this entire roadmap. So each of these programs, projects and initiatives kicks off a project, and the first part of that project is solution architecture, and solution architecture's job is to understand the requirements, understand the objectives, create or not expand the requirements, but elucidate the requirements, and then to develop a logical model of the solution for that particular domain. So if we look at this project here, for example, it's only a small project. It's getting us from a particular point across. It's achieving a particular business objective, but it's also achieving this business objective. So yes, you're correct. I'd agree with you. It is focused on specific solutions, using the patterns and roadmaps developed by yes, but also utilizing the principles that EA that flow from the enterprise architecture and from the business strategy. I think maybe next month I'll do a session on principles and governance and enterprise debt, although that is quite a long thing. A lot of people get a lot of benefit out of that. Kevin, are there certain industries or business sectors that you feel PEAF is not suited? The answer to that is no. And this is where my thinking and me kind of acting as a consultancy is different from other consultancies. Because most other consultancies focus on helping you do transformation, those consultancies have to organize themselves around the business verticals of the companies that they are doing work for. So if you employ a consultancy to help you with your roadmap and you're a bank, then you're going to need people from that consultancy who understand banking. And the same is true for other verticals. Since we're maturing the transformation domain of an enterprise, it's completely independent, 90%, 99% independent from the actual business of that business. So when we look to mature the transformation domain of an organization, it doesn't really matter. And from the point of view of PEAF and POET, it doesn't matter whether you're a healthcare provider, a bank, an oil company, a transport company, a government agency, a hospital, a university. It really doesn't matter on the business vertical. So in answer to your question, no, there are no business sectors that POET and PEAF are not applicable to, because the fundamentals of doing transformation are the same for any company, or should be the same. Okay, any other questions? One, how can we use PEAF as... let me close this window down. What are we looking at here? Let me put the questions on so you can see also. Kevin, are there certain industries... Sorry, just did that one. One, how can we use PEAF as a guidance to relate enterprise strategic themes to immediate and long-term business goals? Okay, let me try to understand that. How can we use PEAF as guidance to relate enterprise strategic themes to immediate and long-term business goals? Well, that kind of comes back to this very high level ontology of artifacts. So what your question is kind of relating to, how do we relate? It's all about relating things, and actually it's a very good question, because architecture is all about relationships. That's what architecture is. It's the relationships between things. It's not the things. And when I say the value is in the lines, not the boxes, that's why I say architecture is important, because it's all about the lines, which are the relationships between things. What we're showing here, sorry, can't see it. What we're showing here is the entire an entire map of all of the information required to get us from a business strategy or an enterprise strategy at the top down to changed things. Now, most organizations have some or all of these things, or a subset of these things, but there's widespread, I think, kind of confusion, and it's nobody's fault really. It's just where we are. It's because we live in an immature profession, which is why I'm trying to start GAEAE.org. If people want to go and look at that, GAEAE.org, to create a profession. So that, I mean, for example, let me give you an example. I used to work for a government agency, and they wanted me to write an IT strategy, and I said, okay, fine, no problem, where's the business strategy? And they said, oh no, you can't see the business strategy. So trying to explain to people that in order to write an IT strategy, it's in support of a business strategy, and if you don't show me the business strategy, how can I write an IT strategy, is very difficult. But what happens in organizations, because they don't use POET, because they don't use a map of artifacts like this, they only end up having some of these artifacts. And not only do they only have some of these artifacts, they only have some relationships between these artifacts. So number one, you need to know what all the artifacts that you require are, and this gives you a good way of finding out, do we have all of the artifacts we need to do successful and effective and efficient transformation or not? And then secondly, once you have the information, are you putting the correct relationships? Are you relating this information together? So of course that leads into, this is why you really need a proper EA modeling tool, because proper EA modeling tools, their fundamental power is they allow you easily to deal with the relationships between these things. And once you've entered relationships between things, it's then very easy to track things. For example, to relate your enterprise strategic themes to immediate and long-term business goals. That's essentially how you do it. 2. Can PEAF enable business to correlate enterprise architect to economic framework and budgeting roadmap based on priority? Let me try and understand that question a bit. Can PEAF enable business to correlate enterprise architecture to the economic framework and budgeting roadmap? Yes, the answer to that question is basically the same as the answer to the first question. Yes, we need to start mapping out the information that we're using for transformation and the information that we're using for enterprise architecture in a structured, coherent, reusable, reasonable way, so we can then use it. It's always been hugely ironic to me that if the operations parts of an enterprise used data that was as unstructured, complicated, duplicated, missing as we do in the transformation domain, then the company that you work for would just not exist at all. which is really ironic because most of the people working in the a large number of the people working in the transformation domain are IT people, and IT is all about information and data, so you'd have expected us to get our data right. The problem is, of course, we're not allowed to get our data right, because to get our data right and to mature how we do enterprise architecture and our transformation, we need money from management, and management a lot of the time doesn't want to spend any money on maturing the transformation domain, largely because they're all being driven to mature the operations domain, because that's where the money comes from. How about mapping PEAF to Agile? TOGAF focuses on providing a much more structured framework where Agile is moving in the opposite direction. Yeah, Agile, first of all, the thing I always say about Agile, first of all, it's nothing new. I was doing Agile in 1985. And I often describe Agile is a methodology that software engineers just automatically do if project managers would just get out of the way and allow them to do the work they know they need to do in the way they know they need to do it. Agile is not the only solution, though, of course. Agile is only useful in certain circumstances when you need to develop. First of all, you're developing stuff, and you need to develop it iteratively. So it's something that you're not really sure about, kind of where we're going with this. Really, we'll just build some stuff, see how it goes, and we're going to build some more stuff. We'll add on to it, add on to it, add on to it. Because it's not an efficient way of, well, it is an efficient way of using it for what it was designed for, which is what I just described. It's a horrendously inefficient way of using it for what it was not designed for, which is when you know exactly what you're going to do. You don't want to be building bits and then re-architecting and re-architecting, because every time you re-architect something, that's going to mean you basically throw away everything you wrote. Obviously, you want to try and avoid that as much as possible. The other thing to say is that over the past 10 years or so, certainly in the last 15 years, but over the last 10 years, 15 years, IT has moved a lot away from building stuff using Agile or whatever other methodology you want to use, to buying stuff. One of the architectural principles that is in PEAF is don't build anything that you can buy, and don't buy anything that you can't reuse. So you reuse stuff already. If you can't reuse it, buy it, but buy it for reuse. So think about reuse when you're buying it. Last resort is to build stuff, because we really shouldn't be building stuff in today's world. Even integration is kind of getting easier. So yeah, Agile is good for what it's used for. TOGAF is good for what it's used for. PEAF is good for what it should be used for. If I were to map it to Agile, I would, if I just show you that diagram that we saw before, sorry, I need to get another window open here. Not this diagram, but the next one. So Agile, should be able to see my cursor. Let me draw on it. So Agile kind of fits into, you know, this world. So that's where it fits. That's where I would map it. What's the difference between enterprise architecture and enterprise engineering? Okay, so let me just jump to another slide. So let me just quickly run through these things. So strategizing is what the people in the direction part of the enterprise does. Basically, this is where business strategy or enterprise strategy is done. Road mapping is the core of enterprise architecture. That is the high-level transformational planning, figuring out what projects and programs we need and how they all interrelate. Everything below this line is then what I call project land. It's running projects, and projects go through various phases. So this area is what I call enterprise engineering, or this whole area is what I call enterprise engineering, This top area is what I call enterprise architecture. According to you, which one contributes more to quality of a process output? Maturity in transformation or maturity in operation? Quality of a process output. Well, both, actually. That's a very good question. And not because I'm doing an impersonation of an American who always says, that's a really great question. It really is a good question. So what we have, let me just point the questions up again. So what we have is this part of the enterprise over here, or this part of the enterprise over here, I call operations. This is what you call the operations. So this is the core of the organization doing whatever that company does, drilling oil wells, providing healthcare, whatever. Over here, we have the transformation part of the enterprise. This is the part of the enterprise which transforms this part of the enterprise. This part of the enterprise is made up of methods, artifacts, culture, and the environment that it's operating in. This part of the enterprise also consists of methods, artifacts, culture, and the environment it's operating in, i.e. the technical environment. So when you say which one contributes more to quality of a process output, the maturity in transformation maturity, or in operation, if you concentrate on improving the quality output of operations, the only way you can do that is by using your transformation domain to transform it. So if all you do that is, if the only thing you do is that, then you are going to improve the quality of your what your operations produces. If you improve the output of transformation, so we mature how we do transformation, at that point you haven't provided any benefit whatsoever to anybody. Once you've matured how we do transformation, we only get benefit when we then use the newly matured transformation domain to then transform operations. And if you do that, obviously if we improve the engine for transformation before we transform operations is likely to end up with a much higher quality of output as well. I hope I answered that question. Any more clarification questions or new questions? Up to you. Just get rid of this ink while we're at it. This is a good little diagram to show you actually. I'll just show you this. If after I've shown this there are no more questions, then we'll call it a day. So here we have these phases of transformation: strategizing, going in direction, road mapping, which is the core of the EA work, then all project land work going on down here. What we have across the top here is some commonly known titles. Now these titles can mean different things to different companies, which is why we need a profession. So go to gaeae.org to get involved. But the question is, where do these people operate? Also, people say, oh, Kevin, so where does an enterprise architect only work in the road mapping domain, or do they only work in the strategizing domain? Well, the answer is it depends. Depends what kind of work you're talking about. There's something called RACI, which most people know, but it's a way of thinking about the work people do. R stands for who's responsible for the work, i.e. these are the people that do the work. A is accountable, i.e. this is the person who makes sure the work is being done correctly, but they don't actually do the work. They kind of make sure it's been done correctly and sign it off. C means consulted. These are the people that we need to consult while the people who are responsible for the work are doing the work. And I are people that we inform as the work is progressing and when the work is finished. So what Poet puts forward is a very good simplistic way, a very simple way but powerful way of figuring out who needs to do what when. So we first have the A pattern, the accountable pattern. So what this means is
If we decide that someone is responsible for doing a certain chunk of work, then that person in a phase, then that same person should be the person accountable for the work that goes on after their phase. So for example, if I'm responsible for a conceptual design and I hand my conceptual design down to the solution architect to do a logical design, he's now responsible, but I am now accountable for his work. So if we put that on this diagram, so generally this is the kind of the responsible areas. So enterprise architects essentially are responsible for doing road mapping, the board is responsible for strategizing, solution architects are responsible for the initiating phase of a project, etc, etc, etc. So who are the accountable people? Easy, just put the accountable below. So as an enterprise architect, I'm responsible for doing road mapping, but I'm also accountable for the initiating work. So I'm going to keep an eye on the solution architect, not because I don't trust him, but you know, this is the thing that connects things together. The other pattern to figure out who is consulted and who is informed on this is that if someone is responsible for a phase, then they should be consulting the people above and below them. They should consult the people above them because they're the people that they're delivering to, essentially, and they should consult the people below them because they're the people that are going to take whatever output they generate and run with it. And then we inform the people kind of further away, the next level away from that. So if you put those consulted and informed people there, we kind of get that. The reason that consulted, you'll notice, I'll just take that back, you'll notice that when we put consulted on, we haven't put consulted at the bottom like I say here, but well, we have, because the people we consult are the people who are responsible. So that's there, and I can't put green and blue in the same box at the same time. So that's why that's there. So the business analysts are responsible for this. They consult these people, but of course then they are accountable for these people. So that's a very powerful way of, first of all, it's a helpful way of understanding where roles fit into these phases, given the confusion that we have in our industry with the names of things. But it's also these racy patterns are very, very good patterns to allow people to figure out in their organization who should be doing what and when. Okay, so I was talking then, there weren't any more questions. Oh, sugar. My God, I just explained all that without showing you the screen again. Thanks for someone pointing that out. Okay, I'll do that again. This time I'll do it so you can see it. So here we have the phases. Strategizing is what the people in the direction domain do. This is the business strategy, enterprise strategy. Road mapping is the core of enterprise architecture, although we call both of these things enterprise architecture. Then we go into project land, where we go through various phases in projects, finally delivering things into operations where people use them in operations. Across the top here we have these different types of people that may or may not agree with names you use in your organization. So here we have this A pattern that I was talking about. If we make somebody responsible in one phase, then that same person needs to be accountable in the phase below. So if we put the responsibles on here, the enterprise architect is responsible here for road mapping. Is he responsible for the business strategy? Well, no, he's not responsible for it. Oh, Kevin, well, does that mean he doesn't, I thought you said this is enterprise architecture, but you've not drawn enterprise architects here. That is because the enterprise architect is consulted up here. He's more of an advisor and a facilitator. So if we want to put the accountable on, that's just the people below. So the board, who are responsible for do that, become accountable for the roadmap. They don't do the roadmap, but they're accountable for the roadmap. Enterprise architects do the roadmap. When we've done the roadmap, we don't do the logical
designs that solution architects do, but we become accountable for those solution designs. This is where the governance and lobbying comes in. I won't go through all these other same phases. And the CI pattern that I was referring to is here. So who do we consult and who do we inform? Well, we consult people above and below responsible. So we need to put a blue above and below each of these responsibles. Well, we can put a blue above, but we can't put a blue below because there's already a red one there. We could make that AC, but that's why there's no blue here. It's kind of an inferred blue. Which of the people do we inform? That's the next level out. So they're the people that we inform. So if somebody says to you, oh, where does an enterprise architect work? Well, the enterprise architect works in all phases, but he does different things in different phases. He's consulted and he's a facilitator when we're doing the strategy. He's responsible for doing the work when we're doing the road mapping. He's accountable for solution architected work that's going on in projects, and then he gets informed as to the detailed work that goes on in projects. Solution architects are responsible for doing the solution architecture, but solution architects are consulted when the enterprise architect is doing the enterprise architecture, etc., etc. So as I say, this is I think it's a useful thing for people to see perhaps where they fit into this and where other people fit into these domains, and how interconnected these things are. And if you want to figure out who should be doing what in what phase, then these patterns are very powerful patterns to allow you to do that. 4. How do you see the scope of automation and or AI in the field of EA and other related domain? Or maybe I'll ask it in another way. What all qualities of human EA can't be replaced by technology? Okay, so the first thing is EA is not all about technology. EA already includes everything that is not technology. So that's the first key thing. Enterprise architecture as described by POET and PEAF, and what I would call true enterprise architecture, is the architecture of the enterprise and the transformation roadmaps of the enterprise, part of which is the technology. Regarding automation, automation is one of those kind of double-edged swords. Automation, on the one hand, I could say automation is the latest thing consultancies and automation tool vendors are pushing to allow companies to get rid of people and save a lot of money very, very fast. It's kind of, it's integration at the screen level, basically. So automating, maybe I'm talking about robotics. I'm not sure whether you're talking about robotics. Arnab, when you say automation, are you talking about just the normal way we try to automate things by replacing manual processes with automated processes, or are you talking about robotics? I think you weren't talking about robotics, actually. I think you're talking about normal automation, reading the second part of your question. So to answer your question, what qualities of human EA can't be replaced by technology? So if you're talking about what work does an enterprise architect do that can't be replaced by technology, quite a lot of it. The further up this stack you get, the less technology can help, because the more complex the issues become. But technology can help a lot. I mean, enterprise architecture modeling tools, some modeling tools just allow you to draw pictures. You have to do everything else yourself. Other tools allow you to do simulations. So you can build an architecture and say, well, this is our current architecture of the enterprise at the conceptual level.
Well, we could have we could move to that kind of a structure, or this kind of a structure, or this kind of a structure, and the software will then do Monte Carlo analysis and lots of different analysis to try and compare those different scenarios to help you decide which which architecture is the better architecture today. Tomorrow it might not be the better architecture, of course, but you never know what happens tomorrow, although architects tend to try to look in the future. That's one of the things they do. But I think there's a lot of what architects do that you will never automate. That kind of leads into also understanding about what architecture actually is. If we look at what architecture is versus engineering, that may help answer your question also. So this slide contrasts different things. So architecture is more art and science. So how much can you automate art? How much can you automate science? Well, you can automate science a lot. You can't automate art a lot, or you can automate it less. Architecture is about why are we doing things. Engineering is more about how. So automating and tools and things like that are very good to help us with engineering, but not very good for help us with all these architecture things. Looking at the whole rather than the parts. Looking at uncertainty. Architects deal in uncertainty. Engineers deal in certainty. Tools deal more in certainty. So I'll just leave those things up there. I might do this as a talk next week, but I need to review what content is in Module A and Module B, because I don't want to go too far ahead while people are still studying earlier modules. Process and automation, yeah, so that's what I thought you were talking about, just normal automation. Yeah, so basically not a lot. Architects and the brain of an architect is required to do an awful lot of thinking. AI has been promising lots of things for many, many years. Again, it's kind of come round again, and people are raving about AI. I don't see a lot of progress in AI, to be honest. Certainly I don't see it helping in any way in terms of doing architecture. At the end of the day, we have much more fundamental problems than trying to see if we can get AI to help us in EA. The more fundamental problem is getting management to allow us to do EA in the way that we should be doing EA. That's the bigger challenge, not whether we can use AI or how applicable AI is. Okay, so if that's it, I'll give you another minute or so to see if anybody wants to ask any more questions. Otherwise, we'll call it a day. It's 9:30, so that's 1.5 hours. So just to wrap up then, while you're thinking if there's any more questions, what I would like to ask people to do is, if you want to make any suggestions as to what you like about these sessions, what you don't like, what you want to see more, what you don't want to see more, what you think works, what doesn't work, then obviously please let me know. You don't need to tell me that I need to be showing a screen when I'm talking about a screen. Yes, okay, got that. Wake up, Kevin. Yeah, so sorry about that. But any other suggestions of what topics you want me to talk about or anything, yes, please let me know. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all for attending. Case studies, yeah, case studies. We'll talk about case studies next month. I'm aiming to do these once a month. But yes, good question. We'll come to that. Thank you for all attending. Got any comments, questions, please let me know. You can keep typing them into here or mail me at kevin@pragmaticea.com. Have a good evening or morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm off to have a gin and tonic now. So thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.